a great privilege for Joanna and I to be invited to speak here today in support of Brett Graham's extraordinary exhibition. Brett and I have been emailing one another for a few years on and off now, but it was only in March of this year that we met for the first time when Joanna and I went up to Taranaki to view the original exhibition at the Govett Brewster Gallery, and Brett actually came down from Orakau and met us there, so that was incredible. And we were blown away by the exhibition, and the exhibition that's here in the City Gallery is somewhat different, but it's no less powerful than the one that we first saw there as well. And I think the reason that we were invited to speak here is because in many ways Brett's interest in how the past is remembered and recorded very much coincides with our own. And Joanna and I are co-principal investigators on a Marsden Fund project called He Tonga Te Wariwari, Remembering and Forgetting Difficult Histories in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that's at the centre of our work on this topic. And just to get an early plug for it, we're publishing a BWB text on that theme early next year called Remembrance, Denial of New Zealand History, Fragments from a Contested Past. And that's with our other wonderful team members, Liana MacDonald, Mātua Tom, Roa and Keziah Wallis. So that should be out early next year, all going well. So I'll talk a bit about our project, and then we'll do a bit of a tag team, traversing some of the history on the invasion of Waikato that the pioneer was heavily involved in, and along with some discussion and reflection about how that history has been remembered and forgotten over time. So first of all, just to very briefly introduce our project. When students of Otaronga College, a small secondary rural school in the King Country, petitioned Parliament in 2015 calling for a National Day of Commemoration for the New Zealand Wars and for the history of these conflicts to be taught in all schools, they sparked a vital debate about memory, identity and history. How do New Zealanders remember and forget difficult events from our past? Why are some conflicts publicly remembered while others are overlooked and ignored? And importantly also, who decides what our priorities are in terms of what we remember and what we forget? So the New Zealand Wars were a series of devastating 19th century clashes involving Māori and the Crown. And our 3-year project considers how different groups have commemorated these conflicts over time and how memory and silence about this difficult past permeates everyday lives in the present. So this is a history that we live with in many ways, even if we don't acknowledge that and we don't accept that. And the study takes us directly into some of the tribal communities at the epicentre of large-scale military invasions in the 1860s, including Waikato. And it was after a 2014 visit to some of these sites, a short distance from their own town, that Leah Bell, Waimarama Anderson and other students at Otaronga College returned to school shocked about what they'd just seen and heard. Since, like most New Zealanders, they didn't learn any of this history at school. And they returned to class vowing to do something about that, and that turned into a 13,000 strong signed petition that led to significant change. And these are pupils in a low decile rural primary secondary school who affected meaningful change. So while that's happening, meanwhile many of the former battle sites are in various states of neglect and decay. Often they're not even signposted. The usual way that they're marked is a road is run through the middle of them, and often the road is named after the military commander responsible for the invasion of that district. So if you're Māori growing up in a town like Kihiki or whatever, then you live on streets named after many of the military officers and politicians responsible for the invasion of that district and the dispossession of your whānau. And so the more that we saw of these sites, these seem like deliberate acts of cultural erasure. It's like not just forgetting that past, but obliterating the physical remnants of it as if it never existed in the first place. And yet these were defining and transformative conflicts in New Zealand history. I've argued in many ways way more important than World War I. So in 2015, Joanna and I were visiting many of these sites in the Waikato, and as we did, we started to ask ourselves, what's going on here? Why the awkward silences and omissions around this history? Why are these sites neglected? This seeming contempt for these sites where extreme acts of violence took place. And so really that was the spark for our project. And I'm a historian, Joanna's a sociologist. We're combining historical and ethnographic methodologies in our project to investigate how this history is remembered or not, and the way that that shaped the modern New Zealand nation, how we live with that history today. And the research is obviously significant because the narratives remain contested and for some groups even buried and denied. And that highlights really the need for reconciliation, which is grounded in a genuine acceptance and dialogue about our history, being honest with ourselves about our past as a nation, rather than just cherry picking out the bits that we'd prefer to remember. And that's obviously a call that a growing number of people are picking up on and urging, including the now former students from Aotearoa College. So that's just a quick introduction to the background to our project.
Ngā mihi o te rā kia koutou, kia ora koutou. It's so good to be here with you today. What I'd like to do today is to jump right in with a quote. And it's a quote from the Vietnamese-American author Viet Thanh Nguyen. And he wrote this is what he said. He said, "All wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield and the second time in memory." And that's a quote that always stays with me. I find it really interesting. And I find it interesting because inside the black box of New Zealand history, the past also transforms into memory. And it does that in ways that invariably affects our lives today. And so in many ways, it's that really that takes me to battlefields around the country. What I do as a researcher, along with Vincent and our team, we follow the trail of blood. And just as I follow the trail of blood as a wahine Māori living in the aftermath of those conflicts, I think what's important here is that in this exhibition, Brett Graham takes us through his own journey into these histories. So he invites us to follow this exhibition piece, which is directly in front of me, The Black Shroud. And The Black Shroud takes us into some of the absolute darkest moments in our histories. And he's inviting us into those spaces, and he's inviting us to consider those incredibly painful memories of the regiments and armies that invaded Taranaki. So, as Vincent said, our research focus is for the same era. It's with the New Zealand Wars. And so 150 years more after the wars ended, we circle back to those old battlefields. And they're all around the country, they're everywhere. And we do that in an attempt to understand how things change so quickly and with such chilling effect. So we visit the battlefields. It's not just to remember or to bear witness, but we also go there to track the silences. So what we're looking for are the things that are left unsaid in those histories. So there are a lot of ways that we could do this kind of work, but what we have decided to do as our starting point is to begin by going to where the ancestors lie on those battlefields. And then later on, we speak with descendants. We talk to people who've undertaken to pass those memories on to the next generation. So, how do we remember the past now? And how do we find words for the absolute unspeakable loss that we see in Brett Graham's extraordinary exhibition? Because I think for me, history isn't just about the really big moments or the larger-than-life heroes with all the military prowess. Sometimes historical and tribal memory is about those smaller, more intimate moments. And these are the moments that often change our lives and shape who we are. So there's a particular kind of memory of intimacy, and it's a memory that I want to talk to you about today. And it's an intimacy that's forged in the last moments of an invasion. And it happens when the people you love are dying around you and you realise all is lost. So there's a moment in those final hours of battle when defeat is certain and you're given a terrible choice. And the choice that you're given is to surrender or die. So you choose to die because you can't imagine a life worth living without land, whānau and dignity. And that is a great and terrible intimacy. So the past doesn't always have happy endings. It can be really brutal, but knowing what happened helps us to understand how we live now. And that's the focus of our research. So Vincent and I and our team, we go to the frontier, we visit those battlefields, and we look for those stories. We look for the stories of violence and loss, but we also look for stories of intimacy and connection and love. And there's one battleground in particular that draws me back time and time and time and time again. And it's on the border of the Waikato and King Country districts. It's just out of the small settlement of Kihikihi. And there was once a thriving papakainga out that way that was known as Orakau. And in the 1850s and early 1860s, there were absolutely magnificent orchards there. And so there were these great groves of peaches and apples and cherries and almonds. And there were also huge fields of wheat and maize that grew on the plains that were all around the settlement. So the people who lived there, the haukainga, they prospered. Their children grew up strong, their children grew up healthy. But what happened in the autumn of 1864 was that Orakau was right at the centre of one of the defining conflicts of the New Zealand Wars. So by the time hostilities took place at that settlement, the Waikato region had been under really heavy and constant military siege for more than 9 months. So the 3-day battle at Orakau Pā, that was the final armed conflict in the district, and it ended with acts of extraordinary brutality. More than half the 300 Māori who defended the Pā against 1,400 troops, 300 Māori, 1,400 troops, more than half of them were killed. But the heaviest casualties came on that 3rd and final day of the siege. And that was when food and water and ammunition inside the Pā were starting to run really quite low. And it's those final chaotic hours that really haunt me. So I want to tell you what happened. At around midday on the last day of the siege, it became clear that the Pā was going to fall. So with British victory imminent and the Pā surrounded, Lieutenant General Duncan Cameron, who was the commanding officer, he declared a ceasefire. And he did that through his translator, William Meyer. And he called on the defenders of the Pā to lay down their weapons and surrender. But he was refused. And he was refused with those words of courage and defiance that have since passed into Māori history. E hoa, ka whawhai tonu mātou, ake, 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 friend, we will fight on forever and ever. So at that point, Cameron called on the women and children who were inside the Pā to leave. And he called on them to leave before the final assault on the Pā took place. But as this was being discussed by the people inside, by the men inside the pā, Ngāti Raukawa woman, Ahu Mai Te Pairata, stepped forward and addressed the troops. And she said, ki te mate ngā tāne, me mate anō ngā wahine me ngā tamariki. If the men die, then the women and children must also die. So Ahu Mai's words showed the waiting army that those inside the pā, knowing that defeat was certain, would die together, forever united. And that was an act of great intimacy, to die together. So it was an act of desperation, it was an act of defiance, but it was also an act of loyalty and love. And it was all kind of rolled into one. And so the onslaught began. In the late afternoon, exhausted and thirsty, because by that time the water had long run out, the people inside the pā made preparations to leave. And they gathered together as a phalanx with women, the children, wounded and surviving rangatira at the centre, and that was to shield them as much as possible from what was to come. And then together in tight formation, they ran towards the edge of the peach grove and onto open ground. So immediately the troops opened fire and a number of defenders were killed. And at that point the group dispersed and people just simply fled for their lives. So some ran towards the Manuka swamp and the Punia River, and that was where snipers on the ridge shot at them and cavalry on horseback tracked them down and bayoneted them where they fell. So a number of women and children were killed in this manner, and in fact Ahu Mai herself was shot 4 times, but she survived. Others died or were injured as they ran towards the soldiers in a very frantic attempt to breach the line of troops. So that was how the assault ended, and when it did, Waikato fell with it. So, I tell this story often, and as you can see, I get quite emotional as I tell it. But I guess the thing is that I never quite know how to finish it, and I think that that's maybe because the ending is still being written with each passing generation. Each time I visit Orakau, I stand beside the battle monument and I peer towards the place where I think the pā once stood, and in my mind's eye, the scene always unfolds before me. So there's the desperation, the smell of gunfire, the heat and thirst, and that frantic, desperate flight at the end. And when we're in that place, time always starts to play strange tricks. It's always earlier or later than we thought. And the tūpuna draw very, very close to us in those moments. For myself, I draw a sense of purpose from my time at Orakau. What happened on the battlefield there tells us something about how we remember and what we choose to forget. So the final hours at Orakau were marked by violence and bloodshed. But I think the siege has also given rise to new stories that have been handed down over time. So those stories and the unshakable bonds inside the pā are enshrined in the last hours of that battle. That terror and anguish are a legacy. Ka whawhai tonu mātou. These are our stories. Each time I leave that battle site, I walk with my tūpuna and I walk with my head held high.
So as war clouds loomed over Europe on the 1st of April 1914, a crowd of up to 5,000 people gathered at Orakau, a few kilometres up the road from Kihikihi, to mark the 50th anniversary of the most famous battle of the Waikato Wars. Cabinet ministers, MPs, the head of the armed forces, multiple dignitaries, and a small smattering of Māori and Pākehā veterans were present for the unveiling of a memorial on the site where Orakau Pa once stood. An early morning train from Auckland to Te Awamutu was organised for the big day, and free rail passes were allocated to veterans to allow them to attend. An Auckland Education Board granted a special holiday to all children attending schools in the Waikato and Waipa counties. Schools that found it impossible to take part in the ceremony at Orakau were instructed to assemble their children, hoist the national flag and give a lesson on the difficulties of early settlement in New Zealand, which would have been an interesting lesson to eavesdrop on. And newspapers throughout the Dominion reported at length on the Orakau celebrations. And for Pākehā New Zealand, that was precisely what this was, a celebration. As the New Zealand Herald explained, the Orakau battle marked the final acceptance, this is a quote by the way, marked the final acceptance of the British mana by a heroic and warlike native people, which had been met by a just and generous reciprocity which is everywhere regarded as an example to the civilised world. And something of that view was reflected in the official Jubilee souvenir program, which was described as marking not merely the Orakau anniversary, but in commemoration of 50 years of peace. But as the Herald editorial notes, this was no ordinary peace. So I'd argue that it was Orakau that gave birth to the myth of New Zealand having the greatest race relations in the world. And for a land that many Pākehā felt was lacking in suitable legends, what better tales to immortalise than those that emanated from Orakau? So in this way you get a highly sentimentalised and romantic version of Orakau openly appropriated by Pākehā for their own nationalist and nation-building ends. Reiwi's Last Stand and so on. And really in 1914 just one thing is missing. The Orakau ceremony is large, most of those 5,000 people are Pākehā. There are very few Māori there. And you know, there's an obvious reason for that, which is that Tainui had no interest in celebrating the place where as many as 150 of their ancestors had been killed, followed by sweeping land confiscations and the destruction of their economy that destroyed generations to lives of poverty. So while Pākehā were publicly celebrating Orakau, Māori were privately grieving, recalling the history and waiatangi, and sometimes even in the names they gave to their children. So in Waikato, for example, Muru, Mamai, even Raupatu are not uncommon first names. So that history is carried in the names of the descendants of those that were involved. And that Māori held a notably less sentimental view of the war than most Pākehā, even 50 years later, was evident in exchanges around the wording on so this monument is unveiled in 1914, and on one side of it is the name Ngāti Maniapoto. And it suggested a few years later that maybe some additional text could be added there. And officials ask, you know, for suggestions, and one is provided in 1916 by a member of the Te Huihui family. Ngāti Toa were very prominent in the defence of Orakau in 1864. So he supplies a draft inscription which read, quote, Ngāti Maniapoto was one of the highest chiefs of the Ngāti Maniapoto and Ngāti Raukawa. He was an upholder or supporter of the kingdom or kingship of Potatau Te Whiriwhiro and Tawhia, and at the time of the war waged by the Pākehā against the Māori king, he fought on the side of the Māori king, with the result that he was defeated here at Orakau, his land subdued, and his lands taken by conquest. So Edith Statham, the Inspector of Old Soldiers' Graves for the Department of Internal Affairs, who is also a leading figure in the Victoria lead, had led the charge for a new monument at Orakau and for the inscription on the monument that was erected in 1914. But she wrote in response to Te Huihui's draft that, I do not quite like it as it does not set forth the main fact that I was anxious to give publicity to, namely that Reiwi was the chief commanding the Māori troops and made such a gallant defence against our men. So Te Huihui's draft transcription had disrupted Pākehā myth-making around Orakau, with awkward reminders of the kingitanga that Ngāti Maniapoto devoted so much of his life to defending, to a war waged by the Pākehā race against the Māori king, and to the dreadful consequences of that for Māori involved. And that wasn't what Pākehā at the time wanted to hear. they preferred to frame Orakau in terms of a noble and heroic, if ultimately doomed defence, giving rise to 50 years of unblemished and unrivaled peace and harmony between Māori and Pākehā. And really their imagined Orakau is conspicuous for chivalry, gallantry, mutual respect among contending fighters, before final acceptance by Māori of their subservient position in relation to the government. And so a bland alternative subscription is sought, and then the whole matter is dropped. So today, there's still just Ngāti Maniapoto appears there without any further inscription. But as the Great War drew to a close in 1918, there came renewed interest in New Zealand's own wars, and supporters lobbied for a history of these to be commissioned by the government before the last survivors, the last veterans passed away. And in 1918, the government finally agreed, and James Cowan, a bilingual journalist, who'd actually grown up on a farm that included part of the Orakau battle site, was commissioned to write this. And his two-volume work comes out in 1922 and 1923, and it's invaluable in many ways because of its extensive use of oral sources. He spoke to hundreds and hundreds of Māori and Pākehā veterans of these wars. And it came really to be seen as a definitive history of the New Zealand Wars for decades thereafter. But it was really devoid of any critical analysis and interpretation, and in this way it didn't really constitute any kind of threat to this emergent narrative, this emergent myth of Orakau. If anything, the success of his book, and which itself had an emphasis on the mutual respect of former adversaries forged through ordeal by battle, that just reinforces that notion, reinforces the myth of these wars as romantic and chivalrous affairs that led to the greatest race relations in the world. And Cowan's work inspires other attempts to remember this history, or maybe to misremember it. And Pākehā flock in their thousands to Rudolf Hayward's 1925 silent movie, Rewi's Last Stand, and in 1940 that's remade as a popular feature-length talkie. And that later film is showing to generations of school children through the school film library service. So that kind of influences the way that people understand this conflict. So that myth becomes the way that people engage with that history and the way that they understand it. And these kind of ideas become deeply embedded in Pākehā culture and endure across a lot of the 20th century. So the centenary of the Orakau battle is marked in 1964, and guests are treated to a special screening of Rewi's Last Stand, of course, the definitive sort of account that many people, or the way they understand this history. There's a hangi, a kapahaka competition, and a concert featuring a very young Kiri Te Karawa. Yet the interesting thing is some Waikato elders want no part in these proceedings, and they're concerned that the whole affair had become something of a circus. And so long as Pākehā continued to use these war anniversaries as an excuse to pat themselves on the back for how wonderfully they treated their natives, you know, that was kind of understandable that Māori didn't want any part of this. The Pākehā narrative of the Waikato War was out of sync with the still largely ignored Māori story of an unjustified invasion of their homeland, followed by numerous and senseless killings, confiscations, exile and poverty. And that just wasn't the dominant narrative for most of the 20th century. Yet thanks to a new generation of Māori voices in the 1970s, Ngā Tamatoa and others, that Pākehā version of the wars is becoming harder to sustain, and it's all but discredited really by the 1970s. And the problem really is that no new narrative emerges of the wars, or none that the majority of Pākehā are willing to accept or willing to hear. So really the dominant attitude is don't talk about the wars, don't mention these. We don't want to hear about it. We don't want to hear this uncomfortable history. It's not who we are. We grew up as a people learning that we had the greatest race relations in the world, and these stories are disrupting that myth, that narrative. And when that silence is challenged in ways that mainstream Pākehā opinion finds difficult to ignore, there's huge controversy. One example, in 1977, the Governor, I think even today, the most expensive one-off drama series in New Zealand history, a story about the life of Sir George Grey, who was an instrumental figure in the invasion of Waikato. And really that depicts the invasion of Waikato as an unsavoury land grab. And there's significant controversy over that. Prime Minister Robert Muldoon launches an inquiry into the TV series. That they're looking for dirt on it because they don't like what they're hearing with this series. And that really, that's the excuse, but it really reflects this deeper unease about these new narratives that are coming through, that Pākehā just don't want to hear. Later on, 20 years later, roughly in 1996, I think, James Belch's New Zealand Wars documentary series is critically acclaimed, but it's also accompanied by a strong backlash from many Pākehā. Again, they don't want to hear what he has to say about that history. How dare they say that stuff about our Pākehā ancestors seems to be the attitude for many. And from the perspective of many Pākehā, it's easier just to forget that these wars ever happened. And really, it's probably only been in the last 5 or 10 years that attitude has started to change, I think, in a significant way, and there's been greater public acceptance of the need to engage with this history, to take ownership of this history in a more upfront and honest way. So we're starting to have those conversations today that we should have had, that generations of New Zealanders were denied. Not just the conversations, but also the access to learning about that history, to learning the real history of what happened in these conflicts rather than that mythical, romantic one. And part of that process of historical reappraisal that we've embarked on today is a reconsideration of how this history is remembered in various ways, including on monuments and memorials. And we saw that last year with the removal of the statue of Captain John Fane Charles Hamilton by Hamilton City Council. And that's just one example of many monuments around the country that for some people are problematic today. And while these figures might be carved in stone or cast in bronze, history is not carved in stone. Our understanding of the past evolves. One example of that would be 50 years ago, people spoke of Good Governor Grey. He had this reputation as a great humanitarian. But today we realise that Grey was a much more complex figure, and his role in the invasion of the Waikato, for one thing, can't be brushed over lightly anymore. So Grey is viewed in a much more problematic way. And I think it's healthy to have this dialogue and discussion around our history and how it's reflected in our landscape, in monuments and memorials, and even in other ways too, like place names and street names. To have those discussions around how, who do we aspire to be as a nation, and do these things reflect that? And if they don't, what do we do about that? So monuments and memorials reflect the particular values and priorities of the era that they were erected. And many of the New Zealand Wars monuments around the country were erected in the early 20th century, just like the Orakau monument in 1914. And they kind of seek to portray these conflicts as chivalrous and noble, not bloody and brutal wars of conquest. And they're really explicit celebrations of colonialism and imperialism. And for Māori who live near these monuments and memorials, or who live on streets named after the military officers and politicians responsible for those invasions, they're everyday reminders of this painful history. One really that Pākehā have sought to ignore for much of the period since 1840. In terms of that wider context, there's a pretty amazing story too in terms of the original pioneer gun turrets that inspired Brett Graham's amazing Pioneer right behind us here. So the Pioneer paddle steamer gunboat was built in Sydney for the New Zealand government and completed on the 16th of July 1863. That's 4 days after the invasion of the Waikato begins on the 12th of July. It arrives at the port of Onehunga on the 2nd of July 1863, and it's soon in action in the Waikato War, participating in the attacks on Meremere and Rangiriri in October and November 1863. And later on it's used to transport men and supplies up the Waikato River. And it had been specifically designed for New Zealand conditions, including featuring the latest military technology. One of the things it had were pipes out the side that could spray boiling water on any Māori who came up close to it in a waka or whatever. So that was one example of that. But it also included 2 gun turrets that were amongst the earliest in the world. So this was cutting-edge military technology. Māori are up against the world's leading superpower, really the world's sole superpower at the time in the 1860s, and the Pioneer reflects that. As the pioneers' role in the Waikato War changed and the lower reaches of the river were secured, the turrets are later removed because they're no longer necessary. It becomes a ship that's used to ferry supplies up the river. One of the turrets is placed ashore at Mercer and the second one just up the road about 1.5 miles away along the river. Following the war, one of the turrets at Mercer is used as the town's jail for many years and later used to store explosives. And later on there are various requests to use these turrets in different ways. In 1914 it's said that one had been promised to the Mayor of Auckland for installation in a park. So, you know, one of the pioneer gun turrets could have been in Albert Park or somewhere else in Auckland. Problem with that is that they couldn't get it to Auckland because they were too large to fit on a railway wagon, so that plan had to be ditched. In 1920, Edith Statham suggests that one of the turrets might be removed to the reserve at Ngāti, and that wins favour because the gun turret can be taken up the river. It doesn't need to travel over land or by rail. In 1921, it's announced that the turret in the township, previously used to store prisoners and then explosives, would become Mercer's Great War Memorial. And it's located close to the town's railway station where the line from Auckland once ended, next to what was once a stretch of the Great South Road, which has also been described as the road to war, and opposite a wharf in the town. And the turret there is placed in a concrete base and had the figure of a uniformed soldier in marching kit mounted on the top of it. 2 plaques are placed on its side, one listing the names of local men killed and wounded in the First World War. And the second wrongly stated that the turret came from the Pioneer, constructed in 1873, so they got the date of that wrong. And a third plaque is added later on, correcting that faulty date. But there's nothing there at all to acknowledge its role in the invasion of Waikato. There's nothing there to acknowledge the Māori victims of the war that turret was used to attack Māori with. So the memorial was unveiled by the Governor-General, Lord Jellicoe, on the 28th of April 1922, and in his speech Jellicoe stated that the new memorial served as a reminder of the cooperation of the great Māori race during the Great War and the chivalry which distinguished the fighting in the Māori War. So again reinforcing that myth of these conflicts as chivalrous and noble. And what he failed to note was that a terrifying weapon of war had been unleashed against local Tainui during the Waikato War and was now being used to commemorate service in another foreign war, or even that large numbers of Tainui men who hadn't forgotten that earlier history had refused to serve in World War I. That is not part of this commemoration at all. And many of those men are in prison for refusing to serve in the war. And the turret in the township of Mercer continues to be used as the local place to acknowledge, to commemorate Anzac Day right up until the 1990s. So it's used for that for the next 70 years. Soon after the unveiling of that monument in Mercer, calls for the second turret to be moved to Ngāti step up. And in 1926, the turret is finally transported to Ngāti and installed in the grounds of the town's domain, known as the Point, and it's still there today. And that's unveiled by the Minister of Internal Affairs on Regatta Day, the 17th of March 1927. Unlike the turret that's still in Mercer, it's not explicitly intended as a memorial to World War I, but it does continue, even to this day, to serve as a reminder of the role of the pioneer in the invasion of Waikato. So, these are examples of how this history is remembered over time. And there are lots of other examples like this, but the pioneer is one of those.
So I'd like to just pick up on some of the things that Vincent was saying about this exhibit, which is behind me, O Pioneer. And I guess for me, when I'm looking at this piece, I'm really fascinated by the patterns of the Victorian era wallpaper that Brett's used as a model for this piece. And when I visit this exhibit, I've looked carefully at how they kind of encase the entire gun turret. And I think it fascinates me for a lot of reasons, but it's partly because for me it's a kind of reminder about how those fairly innocuous domestic features with all the kind of wedding cake flourishes effectively masks the violence that it represents. Making a home on the frontier or homesteading on confiscated lands was always a deliberate act. So for me, this piece really embodies how British colonial rule was often presented and has been presented over time and has been presented in schools as a totally benevolent way of creating these kind of cosy domestic worlds for new settlers. So these are the plaster cornices and lace doilies of empire. But I think it also represents how these everyday objects muffle the brutality and the chaos and the disorder that followed in their wake. Those worlds were built on stolen land. So the New Zealand Wars have left a really huge legacy, and it's often quite hard for any of us who come afterwards, because the thing is, these histories, they're not over. They haven't gone away. We still live in the aftermath of these histories. And there's a term that geographers use that I find quite compelling. I'm not a geographer, but it's a term that always comes to mind for me, and the term is shatter zone. Shatter zone. So shatter zones are places where violence has happened and which is ongoing. So a shatter zone is a place where particular groups of people have experienced invasion or various forms of extreme violence, and that also includes military violence. So as a result of that, entire communities and ways of life are completely upended and often irrevocably. So in some ways you can think about a shatter zone kind of like a shattered window where you've got that immediate impact, and then there are the cracks that kind of radiate and splinter outwards beyond that immediate point of collision. And that can happen over a period of time. So that's what geographers call a shatter zone. And in that sense, Waikato and Taranaki are shatter zones. They're shatter zones for New Zealand history. So they're places where the impact of invasion continues to reverberate in our lives today in all sorts of ways. And so I think as visitors to this exhibition and by coming here today, what you've actually done and what you're doing right now is you've chosen to walk into the shatter zone. And by virtue of being here this afternoon, you've chosen to walk into those still deadly moments when the talking stops and the fighting begins. So in a sense, we're all following that trail of blood today. And in fact, we're quite literally following the Black Shroud, which is the entry point to this exhibition. And I think the thing is that once you know these stories, you can't ever unknow them. So that I think they're more than just a call to greater understanding. They're a call to action. So breaking the silences around these histories is a powerful and important thing to do. And these stories are very powerful. They didn't happen in Gallipoli or Passchendaele or in other theatres of war overseas. They happened here. And our tupuna and all those others who died in the fighting are buried here. So these stories are powerful, they have the power to heal, but they also remind us that we still live in the shadow of that violence. And all of this matters because these and this exhibition, the work that we're doing in the battle sites, these are all tales from the shatter zone. And they have the potential to change our minds and to change our lives. They have the potential to change our future. So these stories can bring us together in new ways as we forge new understandings about the difficult and violent and unresolved past. But if they're told carelessly, they can push us further apart, because these stories are powerful. These stories will outlive us. Kia ora.